epistemological tradition, which is primarily contribution has come from Alvin Goldman, if some of you are aware of his work, Philip Kitcher, with whom I was in Columbia University for the Fulbright project, and Helen Longino. So I'm not going to get too much into their work as such, but drawing from the way they have helped in shaping this entire understanding of science, where science can be seen as integrated with the social. So the broad spectrum is not only the question or the idea of questioning the idea of value-free science. If you have familiarity with the logical positivism, they talked about this value-free science. So we are going to question that, and this is what all social epistemology. But also, it is important to see the development in philosophy where an analysis, appropriate analysis of scientific knowledge can help us see this reconciliation of the objectivity of science, which someone like logical positivists talk about, along with the social and cultural constructs. So this position is neither totally a social constructivist one and not like a positivist or individualist epistemologist. So it somewhere mediates between the two, and I subscribe to that position. So as you could have guessed by now, that this position is more of a pluralist conception of knowledge. And the paper, the talk, is going to propose that kind of a pluralist idea of knowledge. And it suggests for an epistemic authority of science, because science has an authority in society. And this authority can be seen as resting upon its organized sociality, not in its isolation from the society, which enables disagreements, critique, and also convergence towards the kind of beliefs which we formulate in the society using scientific claims. Therefore, the claim is that any epistemology of science must acknowledge the social epistemic practice and look beyond the rational social dichotomy. The dichotomy is either it is social or it is rational and objective, which is now being challenged in this particular approach which I am following. So it can be argued that the cognitive aspects of the practice of sciences might be integrated with the social aspects of it. Such understanding of science makes it as one of the most refined expression of our capacity to cooperate in a very knowledgeable way. If slides are on, the second slide you can show after the title. So we often picture science through familiar images. Image of Newton under apple tree, seeing the falling of apple and comes out with law of gravitation. Einstein in deep thought, or perhaps a lone researcher in a white coat sitting in a lab grappling with different experimentations and using a microscope or a telescope. And these figures capture our imagination because they represent the individual quest for truth. Next slide, please. But if we shift our focus to something which is closer home, let us think about India's Mars mission or Chandrayana, which we all came to know through media, and also some of us might have inquired a little deeper into it. If you are asked that who is responsible for such contribution or discoveries involved in making that mission successful, you cannot single out a person which could be said to have calculated its trajectory, managed its system, or solved its unanticipatory problems. So it was an extraordinary instance of knowing together. Hundreds of scientists, engineers, technicians, coordinating knowledge, trusting each other's expertise, and aligning their efforts towards a shared epistemic goal. Now think of a very simple newspaper read, or maybe in your social media, when you see something like a new study shows that black coffee has a positive effect on your brain health or on weight loss or something. Now, every week, what makes one laboratory result headlines material in a media or on social media, and another quietly disappear. Now, behind all these lies a dense and deep social structure, a deep social web of knowledge, a web of journals, funding agencies, peer reviewers, policy and market interests, and cultural expectations, all shaping what counts as credible or significant scientific knowledge. And that is precisely where I wish to begin our discussion today, by rethinking science not merely as an individual exercise in reasoning or observation, but as a social epistemic practice, a collective enterprise in which knowledge is produced, certified, circulated, and even contested within a network of social relations, institutions, and values. There could be several such stories that most of us might have heard in some versions or the other. If you remember Alexander Fleming discovering penicillin, and you know that who discovered this, who have discovered the electric bulb and all those. So we single out a particular scientist. Now that story, if you look more closely, you will see that Fleming, it is said in one of the popular story that Fleming returned after vacation in 1928, and he found in his lab a petri dish which was contaminated, and it has a mold on it. And what he found after a while, that the mold has also killed the bacteria around it in the same petri dish. So it was an accidental discovery, but what we call serendipity in science. But if you look little more in deeper sense, then you will see that this discovery would not have been possible had it only been an effort of one scientist. There's an n number of researchers who were part of it, the laboratory workers, lab assistants, and you will see this network of people. Some of them are not known to most of us, but Howard Florey or Ernest Chain, Norman Hitley, and a lot of technicians and researchers, and including some of the agricultural scientists. So you'll see that penicillin was not discovered by Fleming, not discovered by Fleming alone, but it was discovered through an epistemic community, a structure of collaboration, communication, and trust. So clearly, science is not merely a cognitive enterprise, but a social epistemic practice, a distributed system of inquiry, where knowledge is generated, tested, and stabilized through social interaction. So the old image of a solitary thinker seeking certainty has to give way to a picture of knowing together, where truth is the product of organized cooperation, disagreement, and also of critique. So perhaps we can say in case of Fleming and the penicillin case that if Fleming had cleaned his lab properly, the world might have waited a bit longer for antibiotics. But if he had worked alone, it might never have had them at all. So the story of Gaganiana or penicillin or black coffee, they are all efforts of an organized, shared, sustained work of producing knowledge through a network of communication, and that requires institutional setups, a lot of trust within those structures of the institution. So what we in philosophy call a division of cognitive labor. You cannot be singly doing all the work, so the cognitive labor is equally divided. So none of these are reducible to a single knower, single knower's mental state. Now if you look at it in the philosophical discourse, you will be able to link it with the individual knower in philosophy, starting from Descartes, Plato. You will see that they all talked about knower, who is an individual. So we are going to challenge that position and see that there is a kind of an incompleteness, and that lacks the comprehensive approach which requires to be seen in knowledge creation. So here I am briefly tracing how the idea of science as a social practice emerged, beginning from the individualistic foundation of modern epistemology, and moving towards a view in which the social dimensions of inquiry are not only background conditions, because there are those who say they are only background conditions and knowledge is created by individuals. Even this is not acceptable, but they are constitutive of, those background conditions are constitutive of knowledge itself. Next slide. So I am following the philosophical sphere of first identifying the question, what we call Purupaksh, on which we are posing this problem of social epistemics. So if I take a brief look at the long history of Western epistemology, the dominant images that emerge is without an exception a solitary knower. It begins as many philosophical stories go with Descartes. Even before that, Plato would talk about knowledge as a recollection. So you can see that it is only recollection from the soul by an individual. Descartes sitting by the fire, debating everything, doubting everything that can be doubted. The external world, the senses, even his own body, until he finds one point of absolute certainty. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That phrase didn't just inaugurate modern philosophy, it also gave birth to a particular model of the knowing subject, a detached, introspective consciousness standing over and against the world, the social world, seeking foundation for belief in the clear and distinct operation of the mind. Next slide. From Descartes onwards, this figure of the epistemic individual, that epistemic individual which is autonomous, self-certifying, and ideally free of social contamination, shaped much of the modern philosophy of knowledge. Whether we think of Locke's empiricist mind as a blank slate receiving impressions, or of Kant's transcendental subject organizing experience through a priori categories, the concern was always to locate knowledge in the relationship between the individual mind and the objective world. Even in the 20th century, logical positivism, which I just cited some time ago, carried this inheritance forward. They seek to reconstruct the language of science in terms of an ideal observer who could describe the world from a standpoint of neutrality and methodological purity. And that's why we called it a value-free science. Science, on this view, was a kind of perfected individual rationality, the model of epistemic virtue. Such idealization of the solitary knower in traditional epistemology was supported by reasoning, observing, and inferring in isolation from the others. It systematically bracketed out the social, institutional, and communicative conditions that make knowledge possible. It remained blind to the fact that nearly all our knowledge depends on others, on testimony, division of labor, and institutional structures. Goldman and others, as I named earlier, they observed that this individualistic orientation left epistemology remarkably impoverished, poor, incomplete, inadequate. Now the next section. Hence the move towards the other part of the epistemological journey is very important. So it's not necessary that we reject the individualistic epistemology in order to integrate it with the social. Hence I will be covering those who have made an attempt to dissociate from the individual epistemology, and then they try to move entirely into the social journey, so the social aspect of it. So even the birth of modern science, if we look closely, as I have given you certain instances of it, was already a social epistemic event. Yet, strangely, philosophical epistemology continued to insist on the solitary character of knowledge. In asking what is knowledge or what justifies belief, philosophers kept imagining an individual subject, assessing evidence privately. The question, how do we know, that plural we, pronoun we, was until quite recently treated as irrelevant. So mid-20th century began to challenge that picture of knowledge. And all of you might have heard of Thomas Kuhn's great work, structure of scientific revolution. That was very crucial. Kuhn argued that scientific rationality is historically and socially conditioned. Paradigms guide what scientists see, how they interpret data, and when they decide what a theory has failed, when a theory has failed. So knowledge, in other words, is not a matter of isolated perception, but of a shared framework of meaning. This was an intellectual shift in the philosophical tradition. If science standards of rationality were rooted in social paradigm, could there be such a thing as objective truth? And that remained the biggest question for Kuhn, if you remember. So the objectivity and rationality seems to be denied in Kuhnian framework. That was an allegation which was defended by Kuhn, that he is not really saying that. So Kuhn's work opened the door to thinking of knowledge as social. Around the same time, sociologists of knowledge like Carl Menchem and other Edinburgh Strong program, which we popularly call, went further, arguing that scientific beliefs, true or false, could be explained in terms of social interest and practices. That sustained them. That sustains them. So philosophers were uncomfortable with this approach as well, as it seems to be compromising the central epistemic quest of objectivity, rationality, and truth. If everything in science is socially constructed, what becomes of its claim to truth? And that remained a serious question all through those traditions, when the sociological turn was introduced by Kuhn and others. And then came a more radical group, which have again made a very, very substantial move. Next slide, slide 6. Called social constructivist. Some of them, like Berger and Luckman, in their book, The Social Construction of Reality, in 1966, they examined how entire worlds of meaning are created through social interaction. But their aim was descriptive and interpretive, not evaluative. And if you all know that our main concern in epistemology has been normative, evaluative. And if that is compromised, philosophers find it very uncomfortable. And they emphasized on dropping the evaluative aspect and made philosophy or philosophy of science a more of a descriptive enterprise. Now, this claim that scientific facts are constructed in laboratories through negotiations, persuasion, and consensus, they oppose the very idea of objectivity, because then it is all about us to believe what exactly would be acceptable or what would be arrived at through consensus, agreements. So this radical social constructivist turn was crucial, very crucial, in overthrowing the myth of the lone objective scientist. But the worry was that if scientific truth is socially constructed, does that mean that it merely gives you a relative knowledge relative to the social context? It undermines the idea that science gives us reliable knowledge about the world. No special significance was attributed to scientific achievements. So constructivists very importantly showed that our categories of understanding are constructed, but they couldn't show that whether those constructions lead us closer to truth, which was marked as a serious flaw in their proposal of knowledge. Next. So now we come to this turn, which we are calling social epistemics. So that tension which we saw in this social turn, that tension between the social nature of science and its epistemic authority, that sets the stage for what we now call social epistemology. And the challenge, as you already might have guessed, is that how to incorporate normativity within this very social turn about knowledge, and specifically in scientific knowledge. So this proposed field didn't compromise on the idea of truth or justification. Rather, it asked how truth-seeking itself is a collective process and is organized through social mechanisms that enable reliable belief formations. Now, there are various ways in which this can be attempted, but there are some which I am subscribing to. They are more closer to how Alvin Goldman proposes it. And this is what I'm going to precisely discuss, because I cannot get into all of those trends. So the important difference which such social epistemics make from the sociology of knowledge group is, and the social constructivist group, was the proposed argument that the process by which we arrive at knowledge are in many ways social and yet epistemically evaluable. That means they are still normative. For example, Goldman proposes a position called veritistic social epistemology. Veritism is truth-seeking. So social epistemology is by nature is truth-seeking. The idea is that if it is about the institutions, social structures, we can never say that the social structures or institutions are meant to mislead, which I'm sure many of us may say that they can be built to mislead. But if you look at it in a short or long term, they are not aimed at misleading. They are aimed at truth-seeking. So that was the basic idea, which he is saying veritism, the veritistic social epistemology. So that way, science especially becomes a paradigmatic case of socially organized cognition. Inquiry distributed across networks of specialists, coordinated through communication channels, institutional rules, and evaluative norms, all designed ideally to track truth. Now, this is a very loud claim, which is again requiring certain evaluation, but it has a lot of weight. So what it says is that social systems are epistemic systems. They are epistemic engines. They produce knowledge depending on how they are structured. So if the flaw is there in producing a true knowledge, then the flaw is in the structure. Flaw is not about the objective. So that is a very important point which is being made. So if the engine is flawed, you cannot expect the efficiency which is expected from the entire system. So epistemic systems have to be structured well, and there are ways in which it can be talked more in detail. So the question shifts from, can the individual know with certainty? Now we are not asking this. The question now is, what kind of social arrangements promote reliable knowledge? And that probably can ensure a normative consensus which we have in philosophy that can be maintained. So reliability of knowledge is now more about arrangements, not about the epistemic knower. So epistemology in this sense becomes a study not of just mental states of the knower, but more of social practices, an investigation into how communities organize themselves to know well. This marks a significant reorientation from the solitary knower to the collective epistemic agent. And science, more than any other human practice, exemplifies this transition. It is an enterprise that depends not merely on the intelligence of individuals, as I gave you the example of penicillin discovery, but it is more about their ability to coordinate inquiries, exchange information, criticize each other, and remain open to others' criticism. And that collective engagement maintains the standard of evaluation. In that sense, the laboratory, the peer review system, the research institutes, and even this conference room or classrooms all become sites of epistemic activity, where knowledge is not processed but performed together. And that's a very interesting way to say that knowledge is performed together. So it is not an individual epistemic achievement. Next slide. So now, if you turn a little more closely to the social epistemological turn, one sees that how epistemology understands science, because I'm talking about this interaction of philosophy with science. So one of the key question is, how do social structures, that is the way people work together, help or harm the search for truth in science? Now this question is very much in detail analyzed by a few, including Goldman. And the idea which emerges, I am summarizing in my own way, is the idea that the ultimate goal of knowledge is still truth, while acknowledging that the path to truth is often a collective one. So in science, the scientific knowledge should be understood not simply as a collection of justified beliefs, but as the outcome of organized cognitive systems. These systems include people, instruments, norms, journals, funding bodies, and all the structures that coordinate how information flows. So it can be called, as some of them, they call it an epistemic architecture of science. Now, for example, think of, I'm giving a very simple example here. Think of the peer review, which is very, very important in any discipline in academics. Peer review systems in journals. On the surface, it looks like more of an administrative work. And if you look more closely, that peer review is, if taken as an epistemic mechanism, epistemic operation or engine for academic standards for a discipline of any kind, including philosophy. It is one of the way community regulates the quality of its knowledge claims. When it works well, it acts as a filter that maximizes the likelihood that true or reliable results are published. And when it becomes weaker or the false claims are promoted, then there are ways in which they can be corrected by this engagement which I already pointed out. So we can identify that there are journals which have good reputation within the academic circle, and there are some which may not have that. And the precise reason for that may be, one of the reasons, not always all, is that the kind of academic standards which are to be maintained in peer review systems. So when it fails, through biases, it could be secrecy, that secrecy is not maintained, or groupings, or lobbying, the system loses its epistemic reliability. And in that sense, science reliability does not come in spite of being social. So just because it is social, it will not become reliable. But it becomes reliable because it is social, because the critique, the dissemination, the improvisation would happen only in this social engagement. So when we say that the reliability comes because it is social, it is not because there are certain authorities, there are certain individuals who maintain that standard, right? These are not something which can be appreciated, let us say, in the previous peer review systems. But the idea which is being promoted is that it has developed cooperative norms, institutional safeguards that keep inquiry open, self-correcting, and truth-oriented. Next slide. Now there are others, as I said, Philip Kitcher, Helen Longino, they also go in those line of thought along with Goldman. And the idea which is being suggested is that truth is very important in all this social acquisition of knowledge or creation of knowledge. But it is also to be asked that how should scientific community be organized so that they not only find truth, but find the right one. So there is a ethical or the moral dimension to it, that it is not about just the truth alone, but a right one, the truth that matters to a society. And that's the reason why I gave you the example of why social media or maybe a newspaper picks up certain news which they feel are relevant to the society. So in the advancement of science, Philip Kitcher, for example, describes science as a system of distributed cognitive labor. So that means no single scientist can master all the theories, instruments, and data relevant to a complex field. So no inquiry advances through a division of task, but also about deciding the normative aspects behind it, the how it should be decided and how it should be evaluated. So each individual contributes only a small part, but the collective enterprise, when properly coordinated with the appropriate rules and appropriate accepted norms, they generate reliable knowledge. So scientists, like they act like economic agents. They have different interests and motivations. And science progresses when these individual motivations are balanced by institutional norms. The simple example could be that as in academics, I may have my own personal motives to grow and achieve certain things. So my personal ambition may sometime become adverse to the very important collective goal. So how this is to be balanced? So the balance comes by the institutional structure. So what we call the structure and the norm may appropriate that balance. How much time I have? Another 5 minutes? So I wrap up with that, right? Or I have now 15 minutes. I have more. I can wrap up like. I will not go to, huh? Pardon? You have 15 minutes. All right, all right. So these institutional norms, they align us toward the shared epistemic goals. So what I'm saying, the individual aspirations, ambitions may get aligned to the institutional goals or objectives only through the institutional norms. And that's the reason why we are saying that there are possibility of the normativity, which plays a central, crucial role, even if we socialize scientific knowledge. Now, if you look at science, we can see science as a kind of organized social systems. Now, this is clear to us. And it is designed through, though not always consciously, to turn individual curiosity and competition into collective reliability. But one can add the ethical and the political dimension, and which may align, as I said, this tension between the individual and the collective. So one can insist that science must also be a democratic epistemic practice. And the socializing alone would not do, because the distribution cannot of the authority cannot lie only with the few. And that is how we say that if NASA or ISRO makes any statement, if it not questioned by the other agencies and it not evaluated, then sometimes there are possibility of our society being misguided, right? We know that there's a conspiracy theories and all that whether really somebody landed in the moon, somebody could go to the space, right? So those things have come because lack of transparency to on behalf of the epistemic authorities of that time. So we see science as a kind of organized systems, and this must be seen as a kind of a democratic epistemic practice. Then only this balance can occur. So decisions about what research gets funded, that should be transparent, what questions are prioritized, and what applications are pursued are not purely technical, left only to the experts, but also to be made available. So the idea of transparency is which we are emphasizing on being democratic. So they have social consequences. Therefore, a well-ordered science must combine epistemic efficiency with public accountability. And if public accountability is lacking, though we are not experts as a public, but every step which an authorized set of experts are dealing with, they have to have a transparency in order to make it available to us. Now, this leads to an important insight. Social epistemology does not merely describe how science works. It can also guide how science ought to be organized. And in this ought, we have a role of a non-expert, which become part of this deliberation. So it connects epistemic design with democratic values. So what emerges from this is science is reliable, not because it transcends the social world, but because it uses the social world. It uses the social norms, trust, criticism, and institutions. It uses them as tools for producing knowledge. So in a way, science turns the disorganized human business of communication into an epistemic virtue. So their answer to the question, if science depends so deeply on social conditions, how can it remain objective? This is not about it cannot or it can, but isn't objectivity precisely the absence of the social influence? And if we say that it is the presence of the social influence which will pollute objectivity, that is the idea which we are fighting against. So absence of social influence would make something unobjective, non-objective. So this question leads us naturally to the next way of looking at it, that how these assumptions that social virtue threat objectivity can be argued against. So social values do not threat objectivity. Now, it is only through social interaction that science becomes objective at all. That is a loud claim. Now, I'm drawing a little bit from Helen Longino, and she has made a very remarkable contribution in talking about this objectivity itself is a social achievement. There is a very interesting work which she has produced called The Fate of Knowledge. If you get time, you can look into it, those who are not familiar with this, The Fate of Knowledge. Now, the argument is that the traditional image of lone neutral scientist working in isolation, untouched by social values, is a myth, and that we have established. Now, scientific reasoning is never value-free. This also we have argued. Now, what matters, however, is not whether values are present, but how they function within the practice of inquiry. Just talking about that there are values which guide would not do, but how they function. Very briefly, I will just make a point or two and end my discussion there. Now, the idea which is being proposed here is that objectivity does not arise from individual detachment, but from the socially mediated criticism. And when we say criticism, this criticism need not to be destructive. It has to be what now popularly being called a constructive criticism. Science becomes objective only when hypotheses and methods are openly discussed, questioned, and revised within a community governed by norms, a community which is mutually accountable, and diversity of perspectives are respected. She calls this process transformative criticism, Longino's case. And I'm saying that more simpler way is constructive criticism. Now, the idea is that a claim becomes more objective when it has survived scrutiny from a range of different well-informed and critical viewpoints. The more diverse the community would be, the more likely that the hidden assumptions and biases will be exposed and they can be corrected. In other words, difference of background, values, or theoretical commitment is not a threat to objectivity, but it is its precondition. One of the case studies which she talks about in behavioral biology, and I will end with that, is a very interesting one, and it is quite in detail in that book I named. The field, the behavioral biology, was talking about the interpreting animal behavior, and they studied baboons. So when they studied baboons, they found that male baboons' behavior, for example, aggression, control over the community, or possessing the females, and a lot of other behaviors were seen as part of the evolutionary journey, and it was part of the epistemic understanding of baboon community. And in that group of scientists, there were no female scientists at that time who were part of it. So they found many things which female behavior they could not really appreciate and couldn't include. They found it very accidental. For example, caring, they thought it's a very contextual, and a lot of female baboons' nurturing behavior were undermined, and they were not part of this epistemic explanation of the evolutionary understanding of baboon behavior. So after a lot of decades, when the female scientists, the researchers became part of the team, they found that it is not only the man, the hunter kind of understanding, but female baboon, the nurturers also, or what they call the famous theory, the women, the gatherer theory, that emerged along with the hunter theory. So the idea, she has a detail of it, but the idea is that it is not that the male scientists were biased against and they were neglecting this very behavior in the baboon community. But the idea was they were not aware of that there is an aspect of it which can be incorporated within that study. And inclusion of the female scientists helped to identify them and give it an epistemic status to many behaviors, which we call the women the gatherer theorist, which includes that nurturing idea. So she says these are kind of possibilities where the transformative criticism may help. So the point which is being made is the diversity of the community may help us to prevail the truth which is possible in scientific claims. So assumptions are required to connect the data to the hypothesis. And when we say that the data is the basis for certain hypotheses in scientific theory, that data itself could be incomplete. And this is a very classic case and where we saw that the incorporation of the other set of data helped us to arrive at a hypothesis which was very different from the previous one. So let me conclude. Given this example, when the feminist biologist entered the field and began interpreting female behavior as a strategic and evolutionary significance the overall understanding of primate societies that changed, and it is expected to become richer, more complex, and crucially more objective. So the objectivity is not the absence of values, it is the presence of the critical dialogue. And this is where we are saying there is normativity is not enough to talk about, but how it is to be practiced, how those norms are to be brought so that the objectivity is maintained. So I repeat that objectivity is not the absence of values or not even the presence of it, but its presence of the critical dialogue among the differently situated knowers. So to know together then is not just a matter of pooling information. It is to share vulnerabilities. It is share the mistakes, errors, and it is to share the achievements, to accept that our knowledge depends on others' honesty, competence, and critique. It means that epistemic virtues like trust, humility, openness are inseparable from the social and the moral grounds of epistemology. So science in this richer sense is not about proving the success of objectivity over society. Rather, it is to speak of science as a social epistemic practice, which is not to diminish the rational authority, but highlighting science as the most refined expression of our capacity to cooperate intelligently. Thank you.
So we have a very rich presentation by Professor Vikram Singh Sarola, and basically asking the question, how social concerns. May I ask a question? Can you just wait for a few minutes, please? Okay. So the basic question he started by asking how social concern is to be accommodated in epistemology. So that was the basic question, and especially he's drawing from some social epistemologists like Kitcher and Longino and many others. So it's a very interesting journey which he has presented, and as I can see, the attempt is sort of coming out of exclusivism, the kind of dialogue which we normally put as objective, subjective, rational, irrational, or emotional, and a kind of middle path suggested. That's what I can see. Now, the question is that at the end, like he talked about care and many other feminist attempts and baboons kind of caring attitude, which is also a kind of feminist feminist path. Now, I would simply ask right in the beginning how this feminist path or feminist approach is different from the kind of social approach suggested here. Just to start with, I know the difference. Because I have been doing feminist approach. But just to start this discussion, just get the ball rolling, I suppose I'll just start with it and of course open for the floor to ask. Thank you.
Okay. Shall I answer or you want me to collect? We can begin. See, I'm not saying, or social epistemologists do not really maintain the difference, and that's why it is more of incorporating the idea that feminist epistemology, especially let us say the epistemology care ethics, for example, is something which, if have objectivity of a kind, then this objectivity can be attempted only from the situatedness which they talk about, where this very aspect is not counter to the already existing epistemological framework, but it very importantly gets neglected. Now, the difference which I believe is in social epistemology, it is a very moderate approach, as you rightly said, more inclusive. So, as you have seen that when Longino, who herself has contributed into the epistemology of science from a feminist perspective, she is talking about a transformative criticism. So it is not really saying that exclusive male scientists have intentionally neglected the behavior of the female baboons and overlooked the nurturing, the care theorist understanding of nurturing as part of the evolutionary epistemic framework. But it was only the absence of the women scientist which has led to it. So their presence, which indicates towards the inclusion of the diversity, and that diversity has helped to get those aspects included. So basically, it is not really a kind of myths which probably feminist epistemologists would, not be happy with, because they would not really talk about a transformative criticism. The criticism is quite stark and clear, that it is a kind of a manipulation which has led to, sometimes leading to, which may also be very true, in many aspects. But here the emphasis was that if you simply include the diverse background and you collect the data based on that, then this becomes automatically part of the hypothesis, scientific hypothesis, without or with people or individual scientists being biased. So even if there are those who do not appreciate a feminist approach and are part of the system, they would not be really affecting the system if the system itself incorporates the diversity. So that was a very simpler idea.
Thank you. Alokji, could you please wait? Let us invite the younger generation here. Yeah, we have a lot of students.
Alokji
And
is
we
ever
would-
young.
Yeah, and we want our young students to raise questions first. And after that, we will invite definitely you. Yeah. Can I? Yes, please. Yes, please.
Institutional
Your name and where you come
Um,
from. That will help me. Yeah.
Kritika Paliwal. I'm from fourth semester
Philosophy.
philosophy. My question was that you quoted institutional designs affect epistemic success.
Right.
What kind of design of institution would be beneficial for that kind of success? Because I was thinking about the utility of all the things we were talking about. So could you please quote some examples? What kind of design were you specifically
Yes.
talking about?
Okay. So when we say that transparency, inclusion of diverse background people who are scientists or data collectors, they are part of the design. And you can have a lot of such aspects which ensure the objectivity, the final outcome, or that is hypothesis creation. So these are, as I said, transparency, for example, has to be part of it. So a simple example would be that we only not know from NASA or ISRO that what are the achievements, but also talk about the details which are there actually, if you look at it, those who are interested in their institutional sites, you can see the details, where exactly and how it is, achieved. So the transparency becomes a very important part of the institutional design, that itself makes inclusion of the society as one who is not only a consumer of the knowledge, which we call scientific knowledge, but also becomes part of its creator. And that's a very big shift. So when we talk about this structure, the design, these are the aspects which we are talking about. I named just two, for example: transparency, inclusion of the people of diverse backgrounds. That's very important. And if that is missed out, then there will be a problem. So sometimes we feel that no, it is only the excellence, expertise, and these are the aspects which will maintain objectivity. But here the point which is made is not alone that, but along with it are a lot of designing aspects, which includes democratic values, for example, right? Openness to criticism. And if that is missing, it will be not possible for any system to remain objective. Because there would be a lot of things which get hidden, which is not made, available to the people to consume. So looking at the society as a consumer is a very different perspective, but including them as part of the very knowledge creation system is what which we are saying is that part of the design.
Hello, sir. This is Hemant, PhD scholar of this department. First of all, thank you, sir, for such a delightful talk. In your first slide, you stated that the knowledge is something that we create together. And in Jürgen Habermas' philosophy, we see a theoretical approach to reach an understanding between set of rational people to through communication they sit together and they reach an understanding. So is it anyway related the approach of Habermas in order to form knowledge in scientific setup?
So the set of scholars from where this is developed, they are typically from the analytical tradition. So there is no as such reference to Habermas, for example, but there are a lot of overlaps. Now the problem when we bring these kind of comparison without any located text which meaningfully brings it, so we avoid, because it adds nothing to the whole concept. So the point is the communicative ethics, for example, has a lot of overlap with this, right? But they are more general aspect about communicative ethics. Now we are talking about create knowledge in an institution like science, which is more of a specialized institution. So I would feel that Habermas would be more closer to the constructivist ideals or the sociology of science, which we said which we transcend, and we say that we appreciate the contribution they made. But it is very important to see that we go beyond it towards this social epistemics. So because in Habermas, would you think that truth would have that kind of a central value? The normative consideration would really matter more than anything else in epistemic framework. So here they still maintain. So you are still actually maintaining the traditional idea of knowledge, which is normative primarily, but without making it individualistic. So that is a kind of a quite a different trend, though in many ways there are overlaps, because we are talking about those pluralist setups. We are talking about inclusion of the common, right, with the experts. So I'm saying these overlaps, if we look at, yes, there are possibilities of a conversation between these two, but fundamentally they are not really going together.
Anyone of the students, please?
हाँ प्लीज आई मीन आई एम बेसिकली माय मदर टंग मतलब हिंदी भाषी हूँ.
हिंदी में पूछ सकते
हाँ, गलती से अंग्रेजी माध्यम के इंस्टीट्यूशन में चले गए तो अब लिमिटेशन हो गई, बट दैट इज नॉट अ एडवांटेज एक्चुअली. आप हिंदी में सवाल कीजिए.
हैं। जिस
एंड
भी भाषा में आप कंफर्टेबल हैं उसमें करो।
They can come back, you know.
Hello. Yes, Alok ji. Alok ji, please go ahead. Yeah, but very brief, please. Yeah, very brief.
I have only three very small questions. First of all, thank you very much, Vikram. After a long
Just a second, sir. It's muted. Yes. Can you unmute? Or you have muted?
thank you
Ah,
very
ah.
much, Vikram.
Yeah, yeah.
After a long time, I was hearing someone talking about philosophy of science along with social concerns and social history. I am delighted to hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hearing our professor, who I think he gave us a very sound background of philosophy of science. So my question comes from philosophy of science perspective. First one is the context of discovery
The logic.
and the criteria, or you can say context of justification, are both constructed by the society or only the context of discovery. For example, choosing a problem, finding, and all that. We can accept that this is being done according to the social norms, whatever social epistemology is saying. But is the criteria of justification of truth is also compromised or also socially constructed? Is the criteria for truth is also like that, which many postmodern critiques of science say? This is first question. And the second one is, when you say that we need certain values for the activity of science, social science, that is transparency, etc., do you see that given the multinational corporations and the capitalist system of profit, especially in case of medical or the medicines, do you see any possibility of democratic activity of science? Because they choose and they make profit, and they are not neither transparent nor they are guided by the social concerns. Third question, and that concerns about the activity of science in our Indian context. We hear a lot about cultural science these days, that is Indian science, Western science. How do you look at this issue in the context of social thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tandon. I am also equally delighted to see you there today, maybe online, but I'm very happy. After a long time, I think we are talking. I'm audible, Professor Tandon? I'm audible? I'm audible, Professor Tandon? Yeah, all right, all right. So I'm equally delighted to see you here among the audience and having these very interesting questions. Now, the first one which you asked, that is context of discovery and the logic of justification. I mean, this is a typically logical positivist concern, that it is not important to only discover something, but it is also equally important to have a logic of justification. Ramanuj was, I think, one of the greatest example, where he had a way to access the equation, but he didn't have a justification for a long time. And for a long time, he was not recognized, and his professor kept on asking him to come up with the justification. And he couldn't understand that why you need that. because the equation is working very well. So when you have a tool, use it, but how I arrived at the tool is not so important, so as long as the tool functions. So this is a typical concern for the modern science, where the logic of discovery found more significant space in sciences, in the modern sciences, than the discovery alone. I mean, another example is the discovery of benzene in dream and all that. So what is being said in this social epistemological perspective is that none of these, that is, the positivist concern of justification, get denied. So we are not really going back from the objectives of logical positivists who emphasize so much on the justificatory aspects. Justification remains central. But if you say this justification is originating from the social systems of science, then it makes much better sense, rather than saying that this is demand of the science itself. Because the very idea of a disenchanted science, which we call the modern science, has that, is a kind of a context in which it is originating. So locating it within the system of social doesn't really take away the emphasis on justification. This is what I think I said all through. So objectivity, justification, and truth are not compromised, and they are achieved by including the social considerations. Now, this is fulfilling the objectives of a positivist without logical positivist, without subscribing to a value-free science. Now, the second part which you asked, that is the market influence. For example, in pharmaceuticals, right? We know that, I mean, market plays a very important role. I mean, there are hundreds of examples. Some of them, if you look at cancer research or cancer societies or diabetic research societies, you'll see the research is funded by certain agencies like dairy or meat, producers. So you will see that what in many systems are causing the very disease, those very organizations or the industry are promoting that research or funding that research. So obviously that research cannot go against their own funding agencies. So the point is, what you are saying is true, that we have this kind of influence, very huge influence. Now the question which is there in our mind about how to overcome that influence and have objective knowledge achieved, for example, in the case of health. So the proposal is not any other way by making the experts take a call, but by democratizing that very system so much that it is possible for the others, as we now know, that they have to list the name of the funding agencies. So in that way, that is the only way, that more democratization of science can be the only way to overcome the influence market may have on the objectivity or truth of the knowledge claims. The third one, which, if I have understood that question, you are saying that how modern science can be compared along with the Indian knowledge system, right? So the idea of modern science and Indian knowledge system, I think the objectives are not really same, because modern science originates in a context in which this idea of science is proposed as having a central values and methods and processes which are very hugely relying on something which Indian knowledge systems was not really prioritizing. Now, just because they have a different framework, epistemic framework, doesn't make one more than the other. I mean, the whole idea is that if we have, let us say, Ayurvedic, medicines, and following a very different procedures of treating disease or handling health, that doesn't really make it different, because it doesn't fulfill the epistemic criteria of the modern science or modern medicine. So I believe that it is important to understand, without undermining the epistemic frameworks, all these systems which are diverse and different. So social epistemological point would be to keep them at a equal epistemic footing, rather than creating a hierarchy of one being superior than the other. And that is the only way the truth in the case of health, for example, or any other field, would prevail, because this would appreciate the diverse way in which the very same objective can be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's not a question. It's not a question, but an observation. And I read it out for convenience.
We'll take up one question from here and then I'll come back to you. Okay? Lopa. I'll come back
Should
to
I
you.
continue?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Social epistemology versus our modern time dilemma, or say effect, working in by some not sharing but intently in isolation. For example, big pharma, just referred by Professor Tandon. Big pharma, to minting money, besides power, besides AI, in artificial intelligence also, in addition to nuclear capabilities, an inbuilt system that is hegemony, to rule and dictate as per their just to do extent of dictatorial attitude against democracy, trust, transparency, and accountability to enable science as a cooperative enterprise, a must for humanity and positive and not regressive evolution. This is my observation. It's not a question. If you want to elaborate on this, Professor Tandon validly asked all these things. So this is happening around us also. By this, what do you feel about this? What is your elaboration about this aspect? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So as you said, and when I talked about the pharma industry influencing the research on health. So this is the idea that we know this hegemony of the big pharma may adversely impact the democratization of knowledge in that particular field, right? So if the cure of this particular problem is to be looked at, then is it not that more democratization is the only way, rather than moving towards a specialist group of people who would decide and who would take a call, right? So that becomes less democratic. So it's like, saying that democracy has a lot of flaws, and those flaws cannot be addressed by an authoritarian rule. Those flaws can be addressed by more democracy. So I'm saying the whole idea in epistemology, it goes in that line, that the structure has to be incorporating the very dimensions which are inflecting. So how market funding may influence the research has to be addressed, so that the finding of the research becomes more accountable to the society and the truth is prevailed, right? So, one example which can be, I think, very handy, because this question may keep coming, let us say fake news or media not reporting the truth. You can have not only big pharma, you can have big, let us say, news industries all over the world. So the point which can be said is, let us say, for example, creation of Wikipedia, right? Most of us are familiar with that. Now, Wikipedia contributions are not written by experts. They are not specialists who write them. But for example, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Stanford Encyclopedia, they are written by the specialist. But Wikipedia, in most of the cases, have a reliable knowledge. Now, when I, as a commoner, can edit that, right? And now that gets moderated by a number of people who can challenge it. So very process of inclusion has made most of the things in Wikipedia quite reliable. Though we don't count it as a research entity because there is no expert involved. So Wikipedia, if you know the details how it works, for example, if a movie like Dhurandhar or Padmavat, something which becomes controversial, which is having an aspect of a history in it, you will see a lot of editing suggested in the Wikipedia. But since there are a lot of people who are included, they moderate it. And if more objections against the editing are raised, then there are more checks. So you see that a majority inclusion has made that knowledge which is closer to the historical truth in most of the cases. So this is a way a democratization may help a system to work function independent of the biased individuals who are constituting or funding it.
Thank you. Now, let me invite Professor Lopabudra Chaudhary from Jadavpur University to comment or whatever she has to say here. Lopa.
Thank you, Shruti. I first would like to thank our Anubhavji for allowing me a virtual participation in my congratulate Sirolaji for his brilliant presentation. And I just, as far as the Western part is concerned, I totally agree with him, and I could trace the social epistemology in Plato's dialogue. I think you two will agree to this. But my second point, actually, it was posed by Professor Kannan regarding social epistemology in the Indian context. The way we see the Indian knowledge system, there I actually, though there is a Purva Paksh and the theories are accordingly shaped as the dialogue goes on, but then otherwise, I find the typicality in the Indian context than in the Western context. So I would like to Srilaji to respond.
Thank you so much, Professor Lopanda Chaudhary ji. I mean, I'm delighted that you are also, being part of the this gathering for this talk. I tried, I mean, in response to Professor Tandon's observation or question about Indian knowledge system being different from the modern sciences. And he began well by saying in the beginning that it is about logic of justification, which has found a central place in modern sciences. So it is the justification which will make the discovery acceptable by the modern science. Now, if Ramanuj, who comes from a tradition which is very different from the West and struggles to really get accepted there, because for him, it was not important to have a justification, even if it is a Devi or whichever way, or he sees it in the dream. But if you found those or you arrived at those, why it would require a justificatory system, because that may be developed later. So the discovery should have a value over the justificatory systems. So that is a difference which I see broadly when we compare Indian knowledge systems with Western science obsession of objectivity in a particular way. Now, coming to the other aspect of it, I do not know much of Indian knowledge system. Whatever I gather a bit of it, let us say the science shastra, if you compare with the modern chemistry, I mean, there are the fundamental structural differences in all those where you cannot see them falling in the same trajectory of the systems. Now, does it mean that idea of chemistry as a Rasayan Shastra in Indian system was not well developed? Now, this question is arising out of a misunderstanding or evaluating one system with the structural criteria of the other system. And there where I think most of us commit a kind of a mistake. As I said, it is important that even a tribal knowledge system, which is having no cultural baggage or no cultural justifications or no cultural strength to support, but only as a living practice, it is not appropriate to evaluate their practices which they consider would lead to, let us say, having rain. If they say certain sacrifices of animals may lead to rain, and this is not scientific. Now, this is where some of the modern, critique of modern science, they are very uncomfortable with this idea. The idea is that you cannot be using your epistemic criteria of a system, in this case, modern science criteria, to evaluate a tribal knowledge system. So unless you become part of the tribal knowledge system, you cannot be evaluating it as an outsider. I mean, there are problems because it may lead to relativistic proposal, but the merit of it, this proposal, is that this inclusiveness may lead to a lot of findings which otherwise may not be accessible through modern scientific systems. So it is not necessary that these hierarchies have benefited us. Yes, modern science would be very concerned about pseudoscience, for example. And if some of the people say that many contributions by Indian knowledge system is a pseudoscience, that is the problem. Like in US, for example, they say that IDT theories, in intelligent design theory is more of a biblical contribution. It cannot be taught or cannot be addressed along with the evolutionary theory of the origination and evolution of life. So that was pseudoscience and another is not. And there is a lot of debate about it. And one of the social epistemologists, Steve Fuller, is more of a constructivist kind. He has studied that. And in American system, this particular debate has led to a point where we are saying that should the parents of a child in a school should also participate in setting a curriculum of the school science textbook. So there is a way within the Constitution of America where the local or the guardians or the parents have a particular space along with the experts. So this participatory model in some way is going adverse to the growth of science. We cannot necessarily say that. It may help help in favor of the kind of sciences which we include in the textbook of science in a school. So the point is that this is important. This is very important that the diverse cultures should be included within the knowledge systems, right? And it is not that they are to be compared, keeping one kind of a criteria originating from a particular system to evaluate, because that becomes a kind of a regressive idea.
I would like to comment that Ramanujan, if you are talking of the mathematician Ramanujan, his papers were peer reviewed because what he had written that doesn't go directly the way Indian system is developed. He had to send it to the West to get acknowledged.
Yeah, you are very right, madam. I mean, I'm not saying that in his contribution to science, this was one of the biggest struggle he faced, because he was forced to be accepted in the modern mathematical systems only if the justifications are provided, and he did that. It's not like he has not done it, but he couldn't appreciate the very need of justification over and above discovery. And I gave this as a classic example, because it is possible in some systems that the justification may not necessarily play that kind of a value which is required in the modern scientific systems.
Thank you so much.
एक minute, Rajkumar ji. I'm requesting Anurag ji to add on this particular point, because I mean, he is quite knowledgeable about Indian knowledge system, and how this controversy is growing again and again and coming back.
Thank you, ma'am. There are a few things, they are not questions per se, but maybe a sort of comment. One is the concern which our senior from the department, Madam Lopamudra, is raising, that Ramanujan, when he interacts with his mentors at Cambridge, the gap between Ramanujan and Hardy is on the point of rigor. So Ramanujan and his mathematical insights, when he is not yet trained in the institutional sense of pure mathematics, he lacks, what he lacks is rigor. But then there is something else to this, that Hardy himself, who is the mentor of Ramanujan at Trinity College, came with another idea at some other point of his career as a pure mathematician, and the idea was of mathematical obviousness. Now, this mathematical obviousness is sometimes it transgresses or it makes a tangential path to the demand of rigor. So maybe the terminology is different, but even there also they are making some transgressions of the question of rigor. That is one thing. I have a brief comment to make on this issue, that knowing together in Indian epistemology, and I would like to draw attention of Lopa ma'am and my teacher figures in the department, Rajkumar sir and others, that there is a seventh pramana in Indian epistemology which we often ignore. And the seventh pramana is aitihya. And this aitihya pramana is it is a very specific contextual case of knowing together. Now, obviously, because of a gap between space and time, the contexts have to differ. So, in the Indian Pramana Shastra, Atehe, which is accepted as a seventh Pramana by some of the epistemologists, it has to do with knowing together when it comes to social and cultural truths. Of course, not scientific truths. There is a difference, but there is something which we did so far as knowing together is concerned. Then I have a concern which I am raising here, sir. The concern is something towards which Dr. Tandon and our student Kritika, they were raising their concern on this. Democratic epistemic system, our way to safeguard for ourselves a democratic epistemic system. Now, I come from a very different tradition, from the tradition of non-essentialist Buddhists and continental philosophers. So I'm at some discomfort with all this. And my discomfort is that given the kind of interplay which inheres between power and knowledge, and Foucault has drawn our attention towards all this, I wonder how this democratization of our epistemic beliefs, how feasible it is. And one last thing is that I feel that when knowing together is concerned, knowing together presupposes that the language games which we use, there is no incommensurate difference between the language games which we use. But this is an issue which has created hiatus in the continental scholars. Habermas would say that it is possible to, do away with incommensurate gulfs, but Lyotard would not agree. So what if there remains an incommensurate gulf between the language games which we play? Then how knowing together would become feasible? Thank you, sir.
You have a number of questions to address to, but if you can directly sort of very briefly can respond, because we do have 2-3 more questions. Okay, go ahead.
नहीं उनको जरूरत भी नहीं लेकिन मेरा पूरी रिमार्क की एक तो जो अनुभव कह रहे थे वही मेरे मन में बात थी तो ऐतिह्य प्रमाण की और इसके साथ शब्द प्रमाण भी जा रहा था लेकिन वो बात अभी हम नहीं करेंगे मैं जस्ट रिकैप्चुलेट कर रही हूँ आपने जो कहा मुझे पुराने दिन याद आए मेरे तो बहुत वंडरफुली यू एक्सप्लेन द हिस्ट्री ऑफ साइंस से लेकर जो आपने ट्रांजिशंस करा टोलेमिक टू कोपरनिकस then quantum to artificial to IT and then genetic engineering and so on and so forth. And parallel to it, you talked about the history of philosophy of science, because the earlier one was science, history of science, history of philosophy of science, and there also we have some major steps, Ptolemaic to Copernicus turn, and then after that we have logical linguistic turn of Hempel and so on and so forth, and then Kuhn's Fairbrand's sociological turn. So what next? If Kuhn to 1960 है अभी 2026 है, what next? अब यदि sociological turn की आप बात कर रहे हैं तो does it also include digital turn? Latest जो artificial intelligence का digital turn आ रहा है उसमें यदि हम बात करेंगे तो फिर आपका जो इंडिविजुअल जो कॉग्नाइजर है जो नोअर है वो आप कलेक्टिव कह रहे हैं वहाँ तो रोबोट है तो कलेक्टिव रोबोट कुछ करेगा या वो एक अकेला रोबोट करेगा अगेन इंडिविजुअल तो आ रही है या उसको आप कॉग्नाइजर भी कहेंगे या नहीं है वो क्वासाई है क्योंकि रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी जो आपने नॉर्मेटिव बात कही बात वैल्यूज़ की वो उस पर कैसे लागू होगी चेंजिंग ऑफ बिलीव्स एंड चेंजिंग ऑफ यदि ट्रुथ में भी कुछ चेंजेस हुए तो वो अलाउ करेगा उसे तो ये जो लेटेस्ट अपकमिंग जो है उसमें ये कैसे होगा और एक बात ये हो रही है कि मुझे लग रहा है कि जो भी आप ये बात कह रहे थे ना रीथिंकिंग ऑफ साइंस और साइंटिफिक नॉलेज एज ए कलेक्टिव एंटरप्राइज वंडरफुल वो तो हमारे यहाँ तो प्राचीन में रहा ही है, मुझे लगता है ऋषियों में। तो लेकिन ये आज भी फिलॉसफी में अप्लाई कर सकते हैं ऐतिह्य प्रमाण के अलावा भी। मुझे दैर्य याद आ रहा है इस वक्त में, क्योंकि और उससे पहले तो पूर्व पक्ष उत्तर पक्ष से तो ये तो खंडन मंडन से तो पूरा डायलॉग से ही शुरू होता था, क्योंकि इसमें तो मोनो एक की तो बात ही नहीं है, तो डुअल कम से कम दो से अधिक भी हो तो ये यदि philosophical progress, can we also talk the philosophical progress or progress in philosophizing? If we view this activity as a collective enterprise of thinking and questioning and answering.
We will take one more
यदि
question.
ऐसा है तो सबसे बड़ा प्रश्न ये है इंडियन कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कि जब आप ज्ञान की बात करते हैं, हमारे यहाँ ज्ञान मीमांसा नहीं है, प्रमाण मीमांसा है। प्रमाण शब्द ही प्रमा से आ रहा है। फर्स्ट प्रमा का लक्षण ही असंदिग्ध है, अबाधित है, कॉन्ट्राडिक्टरी है, वो सब हम छोड़े कि प्रवृत्ति साफल्य है। तो असंदिग्ध यानी इंड्यूबिटेबिलिटी वो तो कहीं भी नहीं है यहाँ पे, क्योंकि हम तो मान ही रहे हैं कि ऑब्जेक्टिव नॉलेज है ही नहीं साइंस में, फाइनल फिक्स्ड नॉलेज नहीं है। यदि होगा तो फिर तो जरूरत ही नहीं आगे की। तो फिर उस प्रमा की इंड्यूबिलिटी को हाउ वुड यू कैप्चर? सो यू हैव टू
Two more questions, one online and there's another from Dr. Chabra. So, Khageshwar ji, Jhareshwar ji, sorry, Professor Jhareshwar from North Bengal University, is it? Vidyasagar, okay. Professor Jhareshwar ji, please go ahead. Are you there, Professor Jhareshwar ji?
Hello.
Yes, please unmute
Yes,
yourself.
myself, Professor Tapan Kumar, not Professor Dhareshwar Ghosh, from the same university. Can you allow me to ask a question, ma'am?
Yes, very briefly, please. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, very just one point. Professor Sirola, thank you very much for your beautiful deliberation. The one thing is there in my mind, that is the age of AI, that is if the developed AI, that is ASI, artificial super intelligent, will take over the whole society, then what will be the role of social epistemology? That is my question. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Rajkumar Chabra, please. And this is going to be the last question.
Thank you very much. पहला कमेंट तो मैं ये करना चाहूँगा कि प्रोफेसर लोपामुद्रा ने पूर्व पक्ष उत्तर पक्ष की बात कही है, ये भारतीय दर्शन के संदर्भ में बड़ी महत्वपूर्ण है। क्रिटिक ऑफ इंडियन रियलिज्म बाय डी.एन. शास्त्री इसका बेस्ट एग्जाम्पल है। प्रोफेसर अनुभव जी ने ऐतिह्य प्रमाण की बात की है, ये बहुत सुंदर बात है। और इस संदर्भ में हम भूल रहे हैं चरक संहिता को। चरक संहिता बार बार इस बात की चर्चा करती है, और मेरी बहन डॉक्टर राजकुमार यहाँ बैठी हैं जिन्होंने इसका विशेष अध्ययन भी किया है, और भी किरण शर्मा साहब अपन सब जानते हैं, जहाँ पर आयुर्वेद के विभिन्न आचार्य परिषद बुलाते हैं कि हमने ये माना है, हमने ये खोजा है, हमने ये जाना है कि इस बीमारी में ये इलाज है, आप सब क्या कहते हैं। तो ये जो नॉलेज टुगेदरनेस की बात अनुभव जी ने कहा, ये प्राचीन काल से मैं समझता हूँ विश्व के हर ज्ञान के क्षेत्रों में, सभ्यता के क्षेत्रों में रहा। एक तो ये तो मेरा एक पहला बिंदु है। दूसरा बिंदु मैं ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि बर्ट्रैंड रसल, मतलब ये जो डिबेट है, ये डिबेट हमारे को द एज ऑफ एनलाइटनमेंट की ओर ले जा रही है। 6th सेंचुरी BC, 5th सेंचुरी BC, ग्रीस, इंडिया, चाइना, ये जो डिबेट है, ये जिसको कि गुथरी फिजिक्स वर्सेस नोमोस कहते हैं। तो ये अब इसको इस संदर्भ में यदि हम देखें तो बर्ट्रैंड रसल और कार्ल पॉपर, ये जो दो बड़े फिलोसोफर्स हैं, ये इस बात को प्रैग्मेटिक थ्योरी ऑफ नॉलेज को भी एक पक्ष देंगे, लेकिन इसको सर्वथा नहीं मानेंगे। इसी तरह से सोशियोलॉजी ऑफ नॉलेज को भी वो नहीं मानेंगे। और उनके पास जो कारण है वो बड़े महत्वपूर्ण है। ये जो कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ डिस्कवरी और कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ जस्टिफिकेशन की जो बात है,
और जिसको नॉलेज ओबियस की बात से उसको समझने की कोशिश की है, उसके बाद भी बुद्धि ये तो जानने को तत्पर है ही कि रामानुजन यदि ये सत्य को कहते हैं तो ये सत्य सत्य क्यों है। यदि हम इस क्यों के प्रश्न को नहीं उठाते हैं तो विज्ञान कभी विकसित होगा ही नहीं। ट्रूथ और फॉल्सिटी में और साइंस और सूडो साइंस का भेद कभी आप कर ही नहीं सकते। तो इसलिए ये जो प्रश्न है, कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ जस्टिफिकेशन, दिस इज द क्रक्स ऑफ द मैटर फॉर नॉलेज। और हम जानते हैं कि रामानुजम ने जो कई प्रकार की थ्योरम्स दी, उसमें से कईयों को बाद में प्रूव किया गया और कई प्रूव नहीं हो पाए। यह उसके हिस्ट्री, रामानुजम के मैथमेटिक्स की हिस्ट्री का पार्ट एंड पार्शल है। तो ये एक महत्वपूर्ण बात। दूसरी एक बात है कि यदि हम नॉलेज को वैल्यू फ्री कहें तो पश्चिम में जो ज्ञान विज्ञान का विकास हुआ है वो यदि वैल्यू फ्री नहीं होता तो साइंस का विकास ही नहीं होता। ये बात मैं बहुत ट्रिवियल बातें ही आपके सामने कह रहा हूँ। हम जानते हैं कि वेस्ट में साइंस के डेवलपमेंट के साथ साथ रिलीजियस बिलीफ को हानि हुई, क्योंकि वो तो जेनेसिस की बात कर रहे हैं, वो तो इसकी बात कर रहे हैं, तो उन्होंने कहा ठीक है रिलीजन को एक तरफ रखो। तो आप जब ये कह रहे हैं कि सोशियोलॉजी ऑफ नॉलेज है वो वैल्यू लोडेड है। देखिए जो विज्ञान है वो एक कलेक्टिव एंटरप्राइज है, तो कलेक्टिव एंटरप्राइज होने के कारण से और डेमोक्रेटाइजेशन होने के कारण से ट्रुथ की जो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है, जो कंजर्वेटिव कॉन्सेप्ट है प्लेटोनिक डेकार्टियन, वो डिनाई नहीं होता, वो रिफ्यूट नहीं होता। कलेक्टिविटी ऑफ नॉलेज इज वन थिंग, और उसमें जस्टिफिकेशन प्रूफ वैलिडिटी की बात होगी। और यदि हम इसको नहीं माने तो प्लूरलिटी ऑफ प्लूरलिस्टिक सिस्टम ऑफ नॉलेज को भी यदि हम मानेंगे और रिलेटिविज्म और सब्जेक्टिविज्म की तरफ चले जाएंगे तो फिर तो ज्ञान रहेगा ही नहीं। जैसे कि क्या जस्टिस है वर्तमान संदर्भ में, आप देखें अमेरिका अपनी तरह से सोच रहा है, ईरान अपनी तरह सोच रहा है, और ईरान की जो बात है वो लगता है कि क्या सही है और क्या गलत है। जैन दर्शन की शब्दावली में मैं कहना चाहूंगा कि अमेरिका, और मैं बात कंक्लूड कर रहा हूं, अमेरिका और इजराइल तो संकल्प हिंसा कर रहे हैं और ईरान विरोधी हिंसा कर रहा है। ये बहुत बड़ा डिफरेंस है। वो हिंसा नहीं करना चाहता है, वो तो शांति चाहता है। तो यदि आप कहें कि नहीं सब कुछ डिफरेंट होता है, सब कुछ रिलेटिव होता है, तो हमारा जो मानवता है ही इसकी फाउंडेशन ही समाप्त हो जाएगी। तो ज्ञान और नीति के जो मूल्य जिसके लिए सुकरात सबसे प्रमुख है, उसका सिग्निफिकेंस आज भी है। और सोशियोलॉजी ऑफ नॉलेज, और उसको जब आप डेमोक्रेटाइज कर रहे हैं और उसमें क्रिटिकलिटी को इनबिल्ट कर रहे हैं और उसी के माध्यम से मार्केट इन्वेस्टमेंट और मार्केट पावर को हम कंट्रोल कर सकते हैं, इसकी बात कर रहे हैं, तो इससे जो वो आइडियल है वो डिटीरिएट नहीं होता। थैंक यू वेरी मच।
Taking them together is the easiest thing for answering a question, because then you can avoid and choose to avoid a lot of things. Okay, given the paucity of time, I will just hint upon, very difficult to take it together. But very quickly, I do not know, see, the comments are very, very important, Anubhav, when you talked about the seventh pramana. I'm not familiar with the Indian system, Indian philosophical system. I think a lot of, contribution can be drawn or interplay between social epistemology and the value of the seventh pramana, how they can be helping us to understand the social dimension of knowledge a little more, into certain other way than how Western thinkers have been talking. I think this is a very important contribution possible from there. Now, your question was on the democratic epistemic systems, right? And in continuation to that, and then you linked it with Foucault's, the interplay between power and knowledge. I think the whole idea of centralizing power, the very idea of power in Foucault doesn't get really negated in the way we are talking about the epistemic power or authority, right? So definitely this goes along with, as I said, with Habermas or the basic motives. But obviously there are a lot of detailing which would not make these two comparison possible. So I usually avoid, because then it becomes a sweeping statement and you make no sense, by making that, yes, it is like Foucault. As I said, the motive is quite similar, and democratization of knowledge as a solution to, right, the growth of epistemic system goes along with how Foucault would probably talk about power and knowledge interaction. I don't see the opposition from there. And secondly, we are also talking about these systems as ever-growing dynamic systems. So it is not that we have a fixed idea and there is a disconnect from the changing society and its norms. So we are definitely talking it together that those changes are to be incorporated. Is or all, including the Plato and the tradition of Descartes, is not individualistic but also can qualify as knowing together. Because, for example, I will give only two which I gave in my paper. Plato talks about knowledge as recollection. The very definition in Meno is, or in Theaetetus, is knowledge is recollection. Recollection from where? From a soul. An individual, like he gives example of a slave, right, who recollects and solves the geometrical problem. So this recollection is only available to an individual. So this is available only to an individual. And this individual epistemology is what which we were trying to counter. Because the epistemic agent is an individual. Now we are saying the epistemic agent is the collective. So the collective is not really there in Plato's definition of knowledge. Second, the simples, when he talks about the methods in meditation and discourse, Descartes is talking about that this is my arriving at an indubitable knowledge. Every individual has to undergo all this process in order to access to that. So he is not saying that this knowledge is subscribed or it is arrived with a collective attempt. It is only a meditated, not socially mediated knowledge. So it is very clear that the Cartesian understanding is a highly, very good example of an individualist epistemology. Right. And Popper, for example, when you say that Popper is, as I understood, probably that Popper is also talking about the social. He talks about the evolutionary understanding, which is there genetically available in every organism, not only in human. So in Popper's case, the epistemic agency is expanded to non-humans. Even an amoeba knows. You cannot really say only humans know. So it's not a prerogative of humans, but it is also prerogative of all organism, including a single cellular organism. But this doesn't bring the idea of collective. This is a very new concept, and this is also not really the case with the sociologist of knowledge. As I gave you that clarity, I mean, I said sociologist of knowledge has almost reduced it to a sociology of, that means knowledge is created in a social context. But social epistemology is talking about individual along with the social. So individual epistemic agent is not denied in this social collective effort. Now, the final point is the value-free science has made a huge contribution to modern science and modern scientific world. Very, very true. I think so, nobody will dispute that. And the Descartes' contribution, I think that's why we call him father of modern philosophy, because he created that space to go away from the church influence or religion's influence. But now we are talking about that this, even Max Weber points out, that this influence has made science disenchanted. It means a scientist has no clue that how science impacts his personal experience of life. He may be a highly religious person who believes in the different way of understanding life and rebirth, but when he enters his lab, there is no connection with the evolutionary understanding which he follows. So the very disenchantment of this science is because of this non-collective, non-social nature of it. So this is where the point is, which social turn has brought into light. That's why it's very important. But they emphasize too much on the social. So social epistemologists are mediating between these two extremes. That was my basic submission. Thank you.
कोई भी इंसाइट या कहना चाहिए कि डिस्कवरी, और वो तब तक सोशल नॉलेज ट्रुथ नहीं बन सकती जब तक कि वो सोसाइटी से अप्रूव ना हो सोशली। अब सोसाइटी का मतलब क्या होता है, या सब नहीं, सोसाइटी का मतलब होता है फिजिक्स में ग्रेट फिजिसिस्ट या बायोलॉजिस्ट या साइकोलॉजिस्ट। सो हाँ, दैट कम्स विद इन दैट। इसलिए हम कहते हैं पीयर रिव्यूड की अब बात करते हैं आज की तारीख। और आप देखें कि नोबेल प्राइज की बात होती है तो ग्रुप ऑफ साइंटिस्ट तय करते कि ये डिस्कवरी है। सो कोई डिस्कवरी, कोई भी चीज़ डिस्कवरी रहती है जब तक कि सोशली वो ना हो, तब वो ट्रुथ बनती है सोशल नॉलेज की। दैट इज द बेसिक बात है। मान लो ये बच्चे लोग पूछे कि न्यूटन, मान लो न्यूटन ने मालूम किया कि ग्रेविटेशन, आप लोगों ने न्यूटन के बारे में तो पढ़ा है। न्यूटन के, मैं आप लोगों के लिए कह रहा हूँ कि न्यूटन के बारे में आपने पढ़ा होगा कि सेब नीचे गिरा तो उन्होंने कहा कि ग्रेविटेशन की फोर्स है। अब ये ज्ञान कैसे बना, वो उसके लिए उसकी इंसाइट है, उसकी समझ है। जब तक फिजिसिस्ट उसको अप्रूव ना करें तो थ्योरी ऑफ ग्रेविटेशन ना होगा, क्योंकि इस बार रॉयल सोसाइटी और उन लोगों ने अप्रूव किया उसको, पर दैट वाज हिज इंसाइट। सो इंडिविजुअल, जो सही कह रहे हैं कि इंडिविजुअल तो रहता है वहाँ, पर वहाँ सोसाइटी का मतलब होता है कि ग्रुप जैसे मान लो सोसाइटी की बात करता हूँ तो फिजिसिस्ट, या साइकोलॉजी की बात करता हूँ तो साइकोलॉजिस्ट। तो ये जो बात हो रही थी अभी, जैसे एआई की बात हुई, तो एआई तो केवल गिवन डेटा है उसकी बात करता है, उसको अपनी बात तो कुछ कहता नहीं, आप जो कहेंगे वो आपको यस कर देगा। प्रश्न ये होता है कि जब भी एम्पिरिकल रिसर्च होती है, जैसे अभी बायस की हो रही थी बात, एम्पिरिकल रिसर्च में मेल और फीमेल की बात नहीं, फेमिनिस्ट सवाल है ऑब्जर्वर का बायस, ये होता है ऑब्जर्वर का। जब आप ऑब्जर्व कर रहे हैं, आई हैव वर्कड ऑन एनिमल्स आल्सो, तो वहाँ दो तरह की वॉइसेस आती हैं, एक होता है इंस्ट्रूमेंटल वॉइस, एक होता है ऑब्जर्वर वॉइस। तो वॉइसेस जो होती हैं, जैसे कि मैं कुछ चीज़ मैंने छूट गया, जैसे अभी बात करें कि आपने वो छूट गया, तो उनके लिए कुछ स्टैटिस्टिकल टेस्ट है। देखिए उसको एम्पिरिकल रिसर्च में ये होता है कि आप कुछ टेस्ट लगाते हैं और उस टेस्ट की वैलिडिटी लाते हैं, तो आप कहेंगे यहाँ आप ये टेस्ट लगाइए, तो वो इन सब एरर को ओवरकम करता है। तो ये जो बात कह रहे थे कि वो ये था कि ग्रुप ऑफ साइंटिस्ट जो हैं, जो ग्रुप के होते हैं, जैसे आजकल जो होता है कि तब तक वो वैलिडिटी, दो चीज बात होती है, वैलिडिटी और रिलायबिलिटी। भाई आप वैलिड करें कैसे करें, ये वो वही बात है या रिलायबल है। तो इसलिए कोई भी ज्ञान वो टेस्टेबल की बात है, कभी भी रिपीट किया जा सकता है। रिलायबिलिटी का मतलब होता है इट कैन बी रिपीटेड अगेन एंड अगेन। और वो वैलिड का मतलब है कि जिसको कि आपने डायलॉग के द्वारा या डिस्कशन के द्वारा उसको वैलिडेट किया गया है, वो भी बात है। सो हिज अप्रोच वाज, ही नाइसली एक्सप्लेन द थिंग्स। थैंक यू वेरी मच।
एक क्लैरिटी के लिए मुझे लग रहा आपका थीसिस में एक किस्म से मिडिल ग्राउंड है, बिकॉज इन बेसिक डिस्टिंक्शन ऑफ कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ डिस्कवरी एंड कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ जस्टिफिकेशन been given by Reichenbach, the teacher of Carnap group of logical positivist thinker, वो 1930s के आसपास दिया है। ये बेसिकली वेस्टर्न का दिया हुआ है ये भेद। और हाँ, ये डिस्कवरी वैसे तो हम हर कहीं भी देख सकते हैं इसे, साइकोलॉजी में, इंडियन में भी हो सकता है, बट ये जो टर्म नहीं, वो ठीक है, वो वो टर्म वहीं से आई, जो भेद आया। और इसीलिए लॉजिकल पॉजिटिविस्ट ने अपने आप को विंडिकेट करने के लिए करने के लिए इस पोजीशन को अपहोल्ड किया, जस्टिफिकेशन को। आप कह रहे हैं डिस्कवरी इज आल्सो डिस्कवरी एज वेल एज जस्टिफिकेशन, दोनों ही इसमें आ रहे हैं। केवल डिस्कवरी की हम बात नहीं कर रहे, नहीं तो पूरे प्योरली सब्जेक्टिव हो जाएंगे, और जस्टिफिकेशन अलोन की नहीं तो वो एब्स्ट्रैक्ट हो जाएगा वो। हाँ 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 जी 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 जी। और वैलिडेशन तो होगा ही जस्टिफिकेशन में। जी जी जी, थैंक यू।
इसको एक तरह से इस प्रोसेस को नॉलेज क्रिएशन की इस प्रोसेस की मेटाफिजिक्स ही थोड़ी देर के लिए ऐसा ही होता जो पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी है या फिर जो पॉलिटिक्स है, जो इस बारे में नॉलेज क्रिएशन को लेके जो नॉर्म्स बनाते हैं,